Wuthering Heights. This work was written by the English author Emily Brontë and published in 1847. The author of Wuthering Heights was Emily Brontë, 1818–1848, a famous English poet and novelist of the 19th century. This woman died in obscurity after only 30 years of life. She was first and foremost a poet, and wrote some profound lyric poems, including narrative and short poems, some of which were included in an anthology of 22 of the leading English poets of the 19th century. However, it was her only novel, The House of Wuthering Heights, that established her place in the history of English literature and in the history of world literature. She and Charlotte Bronte D, 1816–1855, the author of Jane Eyre, and their sister, Agnes Grey, the author of Anne Bronte D, 1820–1849, known as the Three Bronte Sisters, made a splash on the English literary scene in the 19th century. In particular, Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights are like a pair of small but dazzling cat's-eye gems. One cannot help but be surprised to find these rare treasures in the 19th century English literary heritage, and one of them is so nostalgic and admirable that one cannot help but feel sorry for this talented girl, and if she had not died young, how many more splendid chapters she could have left to nourish the hearts of readers. Emily Brontë lived in an era of social upheaval in England. Capitalism was growing and revealing its inherent flaws, labor conflicts were intensifying, unemployed workers were impoverished, and large numbers of child laborers were being brutally tortured to death. In addition, the British government took a hard line against the struggle for democratic reform and the labor movement. The Peter Road Massacre of 1819 is one example. As a result, the literature of this period is also reflected. Our author Emily Brontë was born in such a time of struggle. She was born into a family of ministers to Patrick Brontë, 1777–1861, an Irish minister who married Maria Brontë, a native of Cornwall in southwest England, in 1812. Ranville was his wife and had 6 children. Maria, 1814, his eldest daughter, Elizabeth, 1815, his second daughter, Charlotte, 1816, his third daughter, and his only son, Branwell, 1817, followed by Emily, 1818, and Anne, 1820. The latter 4 were all born in the village of Thornton in the Yorkshire Moors, where Mr. Brontë served as a clergyman in the parish. In 1820, the family moved to the Haworth area, settling in a remote corner of the marshes. Here the 3 sisters lived out their lives. When their mother died in 1827, their aunt came from Cornwall to care for the family. 3 years later, the 4 sisters, led by Maria, enrolled in boarding school. Due to the harsh living conditions, Maria and Elizabeth died of tuberculosis, while Charlotte and Emily survived. Since then, they have been studying at home with their brother Branwell. The family has lived in isolation, and the 4 siblings often pass the lonely hours by reading books, writing poetry, and making up legends. Charlotte and Branwell focused their novels on an imaginary Anglia dynasty, while Emily and her sister Anne created a Pacific island they called Gundore. Although their home is close to the industrial area of Haworth, the house is in the heart of the town and the wilderness. Emily often went for walks with her sisters in the Wild West. Thus, the Brontë sisters see the developing capitalist society of the small town on the one hand, and are infected by the atmosphere of the wilderness on the other. Emily, in particular, is outwardly reticent but inwardly passionate and spirited. Although she does not know anything about politics, she cares a lot about it. The 3 sisters often read liberal or conservative periodicals and enjoy discussing politics. This was, of course, due to the influence of their father. Patrick Brontë was a radical conservative who opposed the Lutheran movement in his early years and later helped the Haworth workers by supporting their strike. Emily and her sisters inherited his sense of justice and sympathized with the resistance and struggle of the manual workers. This created the conditions for the birth of Wuthering Heights. The family's income was meager, and they were struggling financially. The 3 sisters had to go out often to make a living, teaching or tutoring to supplement the family, and suffered a lot of hardship and frustration in these years. Charlotte originally planned to start her own school, so she and Emily went to Brussels for a year to study, then left because Charlotte had fallen in love. In 1846, they published a book of poetry under their own name, but only 2 copies were sold. In 1847, 3 novels by the 3 sisters were finally published, but only Jane Eyre was successful and received attention. The publication of Wuthering Heights was not understood by readers at the time, and even her own sister Charlotte could not understand Emily's ideas. In 1848, their only brother, Branwell, died in September of chronic alcoholism, drug addiction, and tuberculosis. Although the death of the family tyrant was a relief to the 3 sisters, as Sister Charlotte's letter states, faults and sins are forgotten, and what remains is the pity and sorrow that occupy the heart and memory. Of Branwell's mourning is shortened Emily's journey to the grave. On the way, Emily finally died in December of the same year. Their sister, Anne, also died the following May. At that point, the last members of the family were Charlotte and her elderly father. This talented young writer, a household name in the world of literature, later regretted leaving a world where she could only taste indifference and despair, silently bidding farewell to the only 3 relatives in her family. Emily Brontë, as a British woman writer in the first half of the 19th century, wrote only this one novel in her life. It was not easy for a woman to get a book published, so she went under the name of Ellis Bell and negotiated with a publisher before she finally agreed to publish it. Wuthering Heights is a serious challenge to the traditional morality of Victorian society. When it was published, it shocked the entire community. For a long time, the book was not recognized by society and was criticized and condemned. It was not until more than a century later that readers and the literary world came to the realization that Emily Brontë was the greatest genius of the 3 sisters, a genius that transcended her time, and that Wuthering Heights was an absolutely astounding work, unprecedented and unprecedented. The owner of Wuthering Heights, Mr. Inshaw, has 2 children, one named Hindley and one named Catherine. The 2 siblings grew up innocently. Mr. Inshaw promised to buy a good horse for Catherine so that she could learn to ride in the wilderness. But when he went out, he brought back not a horse, but a little boy. It was an abandoned orphan boy. Mr. Inshaw took pity on him and loved him, so he took him home and adopted him, naming him Heathcliff, hoping that he and the 2 children would grow up together and be brothers. Mr. Inshaw loves Heathcliff, while Hindley has resented his brother since he was a child because of jealousy. On the contrary, Catherine soon becomes a childhood friend of Heathcliff. Gradually, the 2 became teenage lovers. This feeling grows stronger as they grow older. But Cindra's discrimination and rejection of Heathcliff grows stronger and stronger, and he is insulted and abused. Seeing this conflict, Mr. Inshaw decides to send Hindley to London University so that Heathcliff can grow up safely. While Cindra is at university, Catherine and Heathcliff form a real relationship. Catherine is a very characterful, selfish, wild, extremely sexy and rebellious woman. Heathcliff's love for Catherine can be described as a long-lasting vow of love. Catherine is also deeply in love with Heathcliff, but her heart is extremely conflicted. She thinks that if she marries Heathcliff, she will inevitably be considered a servant and will lose face to the upper class, and she will feel ashamed of herself and cannot see others. Occasionally, when Heathcliff and Catherine were playing in the field, they would run to another secluded house, the Pictorial House, and peep out of the window to see the dancing master. As they were talking and laughing, the guard dog of the manor came out and bit Catherine. The owner of the house, Edgar Linton, heard the dog barking and came out to find the injured Catherine and carried her into the house. Catherine was too badly injured to leave Wuthering Heights. She stayed for 3 weeks and was carefully cared for. She found Edgar Linton to be a very polite and educated gentleman, and gradually developed a liking for him. She is caught in a great embarrassment. On the one hand, she yearns for the flagrant elegance of high society, on the other hand, she likes Heathcliff's rebellious, barbaric, and brutal character. During the years that Hindley was away at school, Mr. Inshaw fell ill. At this time, Hindley brought his new wife home for the funeral and inherited the Hall property. When Hindley returned, he learned of Heathcliff's relationship with his sister and became very angry. He was forced to live in a stable, and could not eat at the same table with his family, etc. Heathcliff endured the humiliation, and his thoughts of revenge became stronger and stronger. He is determined to change his status, enter the high society and own Catherine forever. Because of the acquaintance of Catherine and Linton, the relationship between Edgar Linton and the Earnshaw family becomes closer and closer. During a visit to the Earnshaw Heights, Edgar boldly proposes to Catherine. Catherine accepts the proposal with great ambivalence. Heathcliff overhears Linton and Catherine's conversation. Heathcliff was so angry that his whole mood and life fell to the bottom. In his anger, he ran into the barn and rode away on a horse, vowing to make a fortune and return to find Catherine and carry out his revenge plan. 3 years later, Catherine and Linton were officially married. Soon after the wedding, Heathcliff suddenly appeared at the Tsunami Mountain Resort in a high-end suit and rented a room at a high price. At this time, he was already an influential tycoon and a gentleman of high society. At that time, due to the premature death of his wife, Hindley was devastated and became very irritable and depressed, only to drink and gamble for fun. He desperately needed to rent out the Tsunami Hills, and this is how Heathcliff lived in the Tsunami Hills. After Heathcliff's return, Catherine, who had secretly married, met him several times in the wilderness. Linton, a gentleman of high society, is aware of their relationship and agrees that Catherine and Heathcliff should remain friends in a reasonable and measured manner. Their deepest and most profound love relationship is completely contrary to the social customs of the Victorian era, which is the main reason why this book caused such a shock at that time. While Linton repeatedly forgives, Catherine and Heathcliff's love affair intensifies and becomes the laughingstock of high society at the time. As the story progresses, Heathcliff visits the Grange in public, which makes the whole estate uneasy. Heathcliff and Catherine brave the storm and go on a date in the wilderness. Catherine comes back seriously ill and unfortunately suffers from pneumonia. Linton still takes care of Catherine. The doctor told Linton that Catherine was terminally ill and there was no cure for her illness, so her only hope was to keep the baby in her womb. In the end, the doctor gave birth to Catherine's daughter. At the same time, Heathcliff rushed to Catherine's bedroom and sent Catherine off with a passionate kiss in front of Linton, the doctor, and others. Before Catherine fell seriously ill, Linton's sister Isabella fell in love with Heathcliff. She runs away to London with Heathcliff despite the opposition of her brother Linton. However, Heathcliff does not have any feelings for Isabella and continues to abuse her physically and mentally in order to get back at Linton. As a result of this torture, Isabella dies prematurely and gives birth to a sickly son named Linton Heathcliff. When Catherine died, Heathcliff was in great pain. He said, "Catherine, do not rest, I will not let you rest. As long as I exist, you will not rest. If you say I left you and killed you, it means I killed you. Since you think so, you do not have to rest in peace, you have become a ghost to haunt me, and you must come to haunt me every day." Heathcliff added, "Lost you, Catherine, although I am still alive, but I have entered the person I killed you. If I cannot marry you, you will become a ghost wandering in this world. I can't live without you, I can't live without your soul." In the days that followed, Heathcliff often laughed and cried at Catherine's grave, determined to avenge his death. Heathcliff lost all of Hindley's wealth through gambling and alcoholism. Heathcliff's son, Linton Heathcliff, is allowed to seduce Edgar Catherine to win her sympathy and marry her, thus gaining further control over the Tso and Grange. At this point, Heathcliff's vengeance reached its peak. The first thing you need to do is to get a good idea of what you are getting into. He even dug up the grave and buried it with Catherine's bones. Heathcliff was unable to sleep, eat, sit, or lie down because he missed Catherine, and eventually died of depression at home. The main characters love each other like a demon, wild and unrestrained, ignoring any moral norms in the world. Heathcliff's hatred is also to the extreme, cold, and ruthless, shocking. Love and hate in the author's writing in the fullest, paving the way. The human nature can be released and extended in the most essential and free way, like a heartwarming symphony. The love between Catherine and Heathcliff was not socially acceptable at the time, and even today there are many people who do not understand it. Their love was the craziest and purest, with no class divide, no external attraction, and no satisfaction of desire, but complete spiritual unity and spiritual harmony. As Catherine says, "My greatest sorrow in this world is Heathcliff's sorrow, which I have noticed and felt from the very beginning, and in my life he is the center of my thoughts. If everything is destroyed, I can go on living as long as he is still there. If everything is there and he disappears, then the world becomes very strange to me. I know very well that my love for Linton is like the leaves in a forest, just as winter changes the trees and time changes the leaves. And my love for Heathcliff is like an unchanging stone in the ground, although it does not seem to bring you joy. Not much, but a little happiness is necessary. Heathcliff, he will always be in the center of my heart forever." The Wuthering Heights threw a love tragedy to show people a picture of life in a deformed society, outlining the human nature distorted by this deformed society and the various horrors that result. The plot of the whole story is actually developed gradually through 4 stages. The first stage deals with the childhood of Heathcliff and Catherine, the special relationship between an abandoned child and a young lady under such special circumstances, and their resistance to the tyrannical tyranny of Hindley. The second stage focuses on the vanity and ignorance of Catherine, who betrays Heathcliff and becomes the mistress of the pictorial fields. The third stage depicts in great detail how Heathcliff, in his desperation, turns his hatred into a strategy and action of revenge. Although the final stage only explains Heathcliff's death, it prominently reveals a new change in his thinking after he learned that Harrington and Catherine were in love, a revival of humanity that made this horrific story possible. A love tragedy reveals a reassuring ray of hope. Therefore, Heathcliff's love-hate revenge resurrection of humanity is not only the essence of the novel, but also a red thread that runs through the end. The author planned the layout of the article according to this thread and arranged the scenes in various ways. Sometimes in the cloudy, haunted wilderness, sometimes in the wind and rain, the eerie courtyard. The story is always shrouded in an atmosphere of mystery and terror. The atmosphere. In the novel, all the author's efforts are concentrated on the portrayal of Heathcliff, who has put all her anger, sympathy, and ideals. This abandoned child, deprived of human warmth, has developed a strong love-hate relationship in real life. Cindra's whip made him taste the cruelty of life, and made him understand that humiliating submission could not change his humiliating fate. He chose to resist. Catherine was once his faithful partner, the two in the common resistance in the development of a true love. However, Catherine eventually betrayed Heathcliff and married Egerton, whom she did not understand or love. The direct cause of this tragic love affair is her vanity, ignorance, and stupidity, but she ultimately destroys her youth, her love, and her life, as well as Heathcliff, who is deeply in love with her, and nearly destroys the next generation. Emily Brontë portrays this character with both sympathy and indignation. Catherine's betrayal and her tragic fate after marriage is the most important turning point of the book. It turns Heathcliff's love into unbridled hatred. After Catherine's death, hatred erupts like a volcano and becomes the impetus for a frenzied revenge. Heathcliff's goal was achieved. Not only did he let Cindra and Edgar die a horrible death and take over the property of the two estates, he also made their next generation suffer for no reason. This crazy revenge hatred, seemingly contrary to common sense, but the best expression of his extraordinary rebellious spirit, this is a special environment, special character determined by the special rebellion. The tragedy of Heathcliff's love is the tragedy of society and the tragedy of the times. The story of Wuthering Heights ends with Heathcliff's suicide for revenge. His death is a kind of martyrdom, expressing his undying love for Catherine, a kind of love pursuit that cannot share a bed in life but wants to share a bed in death. Before his death, he also gave up the idea of revenge on the next generation, which shows that his nature was originally good, but the cruel reality distorted his nature and forced him to become tyrannical and ruthless. This kind of human recovery is a kind of spiritual sublimation, shining with the author's humanist ideal. After the appearance of The House of Wuthering Heights, it has been regarded as the most peculiar novel in the history of English literature. The reason for this is that it runs counter to the sentimentalism prevalent in contemporary works. Deep sadness and melancholy are replaced by intense love, intense hatred, and the resulting ruthless revenge. It is like a strange lyric poem, full of imagination and furious emotion in its lines, with a shocking artistic power. Although initially seen as the naive fantasy of a young woman writer out of touch with reality, the combination of the fierce class struggle in the region and the social phenomena in England that it describes soon gained high recognition from critics and enthusiastic popularity among readers. The three Bronte sisters lived in one of the most tragic times in British history. Their childhood coincided with the rise of machine use, their youth witnessed the fierce reform movement and the riots against the New Poor Law, their adulthood witnessed the 1842 general strike and the first large-scale workers' strike. As adults, they witnessed the general strike of 1842 and the first major working-class Eagleton movement, the Charter movement. The family lived in Haworth, near the heart of the West Riding wool belt. It could be described as a crossroads between a former industrial town and a quiet rural town. On the one hand, the industrialization of the city encroached on the countryside, on the other, the inherent characteristics of the countryside made it difficult for the farmers to keep pace with the industrialization of the city. As a result, these border areas became one of the most serious class struggles in England at the time. The left-wing historian Eric Hobsbawm notes that the area may have been the scene of significant radicalism and charter movements in northern England. Patrick was born into a poor Irish family of labourers and farmers. However, he was fortunate enough to study theology at St. John's College, Cambridge, and eventually became a priest of some renown. Although being a priest did not mean he could live a life of wealth and prosperity, in terms of social status, he was elevated from the working class to the so-called middle class. Good school, good education. Later, he simply changed his surname from Bronte to the now familiar aristocratic Bronte. Although the three Bronte sisters attended the prestigious Cowan Bridge School, they did not do well in their studies. The eldest sister, Charlotte, calls school life a miserable sire bondage. So, the three sisters later developed the idea of opening a school, determined to make rich and powerful men submissive, and sent their children there, hoping to get rid of the fate of women subordinate to men. In fact, if you have read Jane Eyre, you are more or less aware of how unsatisfactory the sisters' school life was, and how these experiences influenced their creativity. This past may be the key to understanding the struggle of intellectual women and the so-called intellectuals of the common people at that time. What is desperate is the educational system of the time. Father Patrick's classroom guaranteed his children an education, but it did not prevent them from subordinating themselves to others and becoming well-educated servants. What's more, the three Bronte sisters were not only economically disadvantaged, they were also women. A simple story with countless clues behind it. Heathcliff's origins are, of course, worth writing about. As Eagleton points out, Heathcliff is originally a gypsy without a name, and the only character in the story without a surname. What is implied behind this is not only his lack of economic and social status, but more importantly, his lack of economic and social status. There is the quality of his classlessness. The surname is naturally a symbol of class. The situation is in fact somewhat similar to that of the Brontes. When the old Brontes changed their surname, it also symbolized a rise in class. Of course, Emily understood this too. She wants to be like Heathcliff, a man outside the system, some kind of Byronic hero. Thus, the system is an important factor in explaining the novel. It begins with the relationship between Heathcliff and Catherine, who love each other but cannot. Heathcliff is a naturally attractive man, but his charm is purely natural. Catherine loves him because of his natural charm. Because of the power structure of society, Catherine does not love him. The novel uses a relationship to bring out a critique of society, and at the same time, to show that a character like Heathcliff can only be loved in his natural state, revealing a kind of Gothic romance. This is an extra establishment existence that becomes a sacrifice to the class structure. After leaving Roaring Hills, Heathcliff understands that only through class advancement can he truly change his destiny. This is of course the result of class struggle, but on the other hand, he sees the structure of the system itself as a kind of revenge. First he gambles with his new master, Hindley, and takes away the Roaring Hills, then he educates Hindley's son as an uneducated man, and even treats him as a servant. On the one hand, there is a sense of class struggle, on the other hand, the author's sensitivity to the two social structures can also be seen. Education is a symbol of culture and social status, and educating a person to be uneducated becomes a means of class deprivation. Another unobtrusive but main narrator character, Nellie Dion, is the main character in the whole Roaring Hills. When she was young, she stayed at Roaring Hills to serve her old master and witnessed the feuds of 3 generations of Roaring Hills owners. Although she comes from an ordinary background, she is knowledgeable and well versed in etiquette. Such a character setting is obviously a subtle feature of the novel. First of all, we can imagine what Nellie's fate would have been if she had not been a daughter. Does it look like Heathcliff? In fact, Nellie is the real villain of Roaring Hills. Her actions are often selfing, and even Catherine's illness and death are directly related to her. If she hadn't been a daughter, perhaps she could have used her knowledge and wisdom to climb to a higher social status. Emily seems to be using the similarities between the two characters to highlight the role of gender in the structure of social power. From another perspective, Nellie seems to be the spokesperson for the author herself. As mentioned earlier, Emily is aware of her struggling status, believing that she comes from a humble background and that even if she had the opportunity to receive a good education, she would only end up as a slave of a rich family. The fact that Nellie spends half of her life at Wuthering Heights shows the limitations of women. However, on the other hand, Nellie seems to have a decisive influence on the novel as a whole. This may be a projection of Emily's image of women at the time. Another sad fact is that all 3 Brontë sisters died young, far less than the characters in her own novels, and did not see her own novels become popular. Emily Brontë is not only constructing an unforgettable story with her extraordinary imagination, but also explaining her understanding and perception of abstract human nature and her aspiration and pursuit of ideal love. The novel is a classic literary work with profound literary meaning. The novel shows the dark side of human nature and reveals the truth about love and revenge. At the same time, the novel also reflects the reality of English society at that time by depicting the differences in social class and status. In addition, Wuthering Heights is a remarkable novel that had a profound influence on subsequent novels and films.